desert, wherever the fuck you are. Let's start streaming and see what happens. Okay, so that looks good. See if this works. All right, I guess we just get started then. Well, let's tilt this way. Oh shit. There we go. Let's see. Oh yeah, we are live. Okay, cool. You can view it. Oh wow, look at that. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, it looks like we're on. Okay. So welcome to the stream. This is actually my first stream. I thought I streamed earlier, but I don't really know how Twitch or any of these things work, so I wasn't recording, and sort of the intention here is to like record as I stream, and maybe throw the video up on YouTube or something like that once it's edited down. But this is Drunken Minis. You know, the idea here with the stream is just to paint some minis, just have a chill time painting minis. I've got a ton of minis to paint, and so I've been kind of sitting here by myself the past couple of days, just kind of painting alone. And I figured, you know, since I'm just here, just kind of on my own painting, I might as well, you know, either record it or stream it and see, you know, if anybody can get anything out of it. So the idea here is I'm going to be painting up some House Mormon She-Bears from the Song of Ice and Fire tabletop minigame. This is the Game of Thrones tabletop minigame. And so this is kind of what we're working with here. On the right, this one here, this blue, was my test model. And it came out pretty good. If you know anything about House Mormont, I don't know anything about House Mormont. But they're like banner colors, so their house colors are greens. So like a dark and a light green is what I saw on the wiki page. And I'm sure there's somebody out there that has a lot of really good information and some deep knowledge of the Song of Ice and Fire lore. But that's not me. I didn't read the books. I watched the show, and I've read the wiki, you know, just a time filler. So I don't really know much about that particular house. But I do know that their banner colors are green. And so I didn't know that when I started this project. So I went with this kind of blue, and what I was going for was a sort of like a bluish teal coming up to maybe even like a turquoise green. But I didn't really accomplish that with this particular test mini. And so what I'm going to do is kind of go back in and redo it. I'm making sure my minis are in focus. I'm new at this. You know, if anybody's watching, I'm like, where's the mini at? I don't really know how to hold my hands or anything. But anyway, I just went through and I did another test up, or mock up with a different color scheme. And we're getting the sort of lore accurate green tones. So I think this is the way that we're going to kind of progress with this particular group of minis. So I went through and I kind of did the green test, and I like it, and so we're going to try and put some more color down on the mini to get it going to finish. More or less everything else on this mini is going to stay the same. I'm going to keep the pelts the same, the leather the same, all of that the same. The only difference now is going to be that instead, moving forward, I'm going to go with this green color scheme than this blue color scheme. So we'll set her aside. Actually, no, we'll bring her out. So we can do a quick introduction to like sort of what we're looking at with these Song of Ice and Fire minis. They're pretty cool minis. They're much more inexpensive than, say, something like Games Workshop, which is like it is like the gold standard when it comes to like mini painting. So they're a little bit less expensive, and with that, I think we lose some of that like high detail and resolution that we get out of a Games Workshop mini. Um, for example, here's a destroyer, Necron destroyer that I painted up about a year ago, and we can see that like these minis are like way more detailed. They've got these really cool dynamic poses. We've got like piping, and we've got little breast things, recesses. I don't know. They've got these really cool phase blade, these weapons. So they're much more detailed, and there's space for this. Like in that mini painting, in our mini painting community, there's space for these really high detail models. But I feel like, especially lately too, Games Workshop is really pumping out these really highly detailed models. And it kind of gets fatiguing to paint sometimes, because you're going through and you're trying to catch all these details and make sure that all the little details look good. And sometimes you just want to take a step back and grab a simpler mini, and get to work on that, right? I feel like there's a little bit less stress, less anxiety when you're painting a mini that doesn't have as many details, than not. But yeah, so these Song of Ice and Fire minis are a little less detailed than, say, like a Games Workshop mini, but they still got some really cool aspects to them. They all have these really cool dynamic poses. This gal is looking like she's about to bear down this mace on someone's skull, which is really cool. And then also the simplicity of it too. It's really cool. Like, if you notice the weapon, I mean, the weapon is just a stick with a hunk of metal on the end of it. It's like no frills, right? Like, much different than something like this really kind of fantastic and futuristic phase blade here from the Necron. That's like the star of the show here, that big weapon, that big blade. Here, the star of the show isn't necessarily the weapon. I feel like it's the character model itself, and so you can get a lot of really cool detail and personalization of each mini, because you're not really focused on those high details. You're kind of able to focus on the simplistic detail of the mini. So yeah, I really like these A Song of Ice and Fire minis. I think that the less detail that they have too really kind of allows us to like practice and hone some of our mini painting skills. Whereas with like something this detailed, you can hide a lot of your mistakes, and you can you can hide a lot of your mistakes in those details. For example, if we're missing some of the coloring, or we've messed up on some of the shades or the highlights on the body piece, we can throw a shade or a contrast paint down, and that'll cover up some of those mistakes. But when it comes to a less detailed mini, our mistakes show, and they're a lot harder to hide. So I feel like having some of these less detailed minis really do help us kind of like hone in our mini painting skill. Or our mini painting skills. So with that, I mean, let's just get into it and paint. I'm only gonna go for like an hour or so. Then I gotta go pick up my kids from school. But you can see I already base coated the bear pelt in the back with a brown, and I can go and do a stream or a video of that when I do the next one. I've already done this under tunic, this undercoat, undershirt here, and I did that in kind of a light blue. Just to kind of not mess with the star of the show. Again, the star of the show for me, I think, is going to be the body piece. And so I want a lot of the vibrancy and the colors to show here in the middle of the mini, and not necessarily up here on the sides where the underclothes are. And so we're going to keep that kind of the way it is. If you notice the difference between the two shades on the completed model and the test model, there's not really much difference here. I'm going to highlight up, but I don't want this portion of it, the sleeves, to be the star of the show. I want the boiled leather body piece to be the star of the show. And then as you flip the mini over, I want the bear pelt, the back piece, to be the star of the show as well. So we'll kind of build these colors up, and we'll go through it and see what happens. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to go through and we're going to paint out the inside of the bear pelts to kind of match the color scheme that I have on the left. And then we might get to the bear pelts here on the legs, and definitely probably the chainmail we can get that done as well. But within this hour that we're going to try and do this stream, we're probably only going to get the inside of the bear pelts and maybe the some of the leather pieces or the bear pelts on the legs. So let's get into it. What I'm going to do for the bear pelt and what I did for this particular one was I did a base coat of a 2 brown mixture. I did XV88 from Games Workshop. I did a 50-50 mix of XV88 and Zamesi Desert. And that gives us a little bit more of a toned down yellow. This Zamesi Desert is actually really bright if you had it on its own. And you can kind of see the Zamesi Desert here because I use it as my highlight. So we're going to go ahead and put a base coat down of these two 50-50 mix. Then we're going to go through and we're going to shade it with a Tyrant Skull, which is... Nope, not that one. No, that's not that. With a Tyrant Skull. That's what that is. It's Tyrant Skull or Skull Tyrant. Skeleton Horde. We're going to go through it and do some shading with some Skeleton Horde, thinned down version of Skeleton Horde. And then we're going to build it back up with some progressively, with a mixture of paint that's progressively more Zemestri Desert than XV88. And that's kind of what we see with these highlights here. Those highlights are almost all Zemestri Desert. And so it'll give us a good contrast. But again, the goal here with the inside of the pelt is not to make the inside of the pelt, the star of the show. The star of the show is going to be that middle section where we have all that color. Everything else is going to be a background color or like a supporting color. My hope for the green one here is as we progress forward and we finish out the basing for this green, we're going to keep the basing scheme the same here as the one on the left. But my goal here is to have a nice, cool, bright band of green in the foreground, green in the middle or in the bottom. So a line of green, and then in the middle there we'll just have a lot of earthy tones, and I think that'll help the green really stand out and pop. But I don't know. We won't see, or we won't know until we start. So let's get started. So first we're gonna throw down our palette. You can see my palette's already loaded up with like all of the greens that I used for that body piece, and so we're gonna find an empty space on our palette. We're gonna give our XV88 a little shake, and we're gonna drop some paint. Probably just gonna do like a dollop of each, little toot of each. Clean it off, and then we're gonna go into our pot of Zemestri Desert, or Zamesi Desert. These names, I'm gonna mispronounce these names, but man, listen, these are all made up words. So if I mispronounce Zemestri or Sotek or any of these crazy color names, just forgive me. But there's our Zamesi there. And then now that we have our two colors on our palette, we're going to kind of try to mix them here in the middle to get the right consistency or the right color ratio that we want. So we've got that little bit there. We'll grab this XV88 and throw that in there. And what we're looking for is, kind of like a raw tanned leather look. I think that is going to be good. And so we'll add a little bit of water to that, make sure it's a good thin consistency. I only work really with glaze consistencies. I'll do substantial, like if you follow any mini painters, the kind of the meme is, you do 2 thin coats, but I usually do 3 to 4 or more thin coats. And so that's kind of what we're looking at right there. That's the consistency that we're going to work with. And so given that it's so thin, we're going to have to do probably, 3 to 5 layers of this in order to get the color saturation that we want. But if we do it correctly, it's going to give us a much smoother and consistent paint scheme across the entire inside of the bear pelt. So let's throw some color on this mini and see what happens. So yeah, if you can see, it's really watery, and that's okay, because again, we want a nice thin consistency. We want to build up our colors. We don't want to just go ham and drop one layer that's going to be like thick. It's going to ruin the resolution, the details of the mini. So we want to keep it nice and thin. Make sure we're not throwing down excess paints. If you notice, I have a little bit pooling here, so you want to pull that off and kind of suck some of that paint out. But just go slow, try to keep it within the lines. If you notice, I've got a little bit of pooling there. We can pull that off, but we're also going to fix that when we come back through and do our shade layer with this particular thing. So don't be too concerned if you've got some pooling in the sort of transitional areas between two textures or two different parts of the mini. It's not that big a deal. But we definitely don't want this kind of pooling here. We want a nice even consistency, so we're going to try to pull some of that paint out. There we go. So now that side is going to dry, and while that's drying, we're going to move to the next side. Let me do this underside. As you can see, I didn't get my primer quite right here on the bottom, but that's okay. Primer is really good and important because it'll help keep your paint attached to your mini. But in these little areas here, if you missed it, it's okay. You're not really touching these areas, so there's really not a chance that you're going to strip the primer out of your mini. I'm going to try to angle this here. Just pull it up and just get a nice quick base layer down. It doesn't have to be perfect. You're gonna work so many layers of this on that by the time you're done, all the layers that you put on are going to really take care of any blotching or splotching you might have gotten. So yeah, we're just going to kind of work it. I would say, again, one of the really good benefits of working with a model that's not so detailed is that it kind of helps us really practice that foundational skill of brush control. Brush control, I think, if you're a new mini painter, if you're just starting out as a mini painter, brush control is the most important skill that you can develop. You can throw down, a slap chop, you can do a dry brush, you can put on your too thin coats or whatever, but if you can't get your brush to deposit paint where you want it to go, it's not really gonna help you progress as a mini painter. So you really want to work on that brush control. Keep your hands steady. I always anchor my hands here on the table so that there's no shakiness or wobbliness in my paint or in my brush. As you anchor yourself, however you anchor yourself, it'll really help you maintain that brush control. When you're trying to develop your brush control, the way that I like to think of it is, think of it like a coloring book, right? If you're running through like a G.I. Joe coloring book, when you're in kindergarten and you're running, well, at least when I was in kindergarten and I'm running through my G.I. Joe coloring book, you're always told to stay in the lines, right? When you're doing mini painting, it's really no different, except for instead of like those big black coloring book lines, you've got these different textures and components and areas of the mini. And so you're practicing your brush control, and it really is helping to, when you're practicing your brush control, it's really helping to develop your ability to keep the paint sort of in the lines, just like a coloring book when you were a kid. So we've got some pooling, but it's going to be okay because we're going to go back through and we're going to shade these connecting areas. And so it'll look good. Now, obviously, you can see that there's a lot of that black foundational primer kind of coming through, but that's okay because we're going to throw, like I said, three to five layers down, maybe more at this point because I am working with a black undercoat. And by the time we're done putting all our layers down, we're not going to see any black really coming through. So yeah. And you can already see with the second layer on this right side of the mini that we're getting some good color saturation. And so we'll be fine when it comes to making sure that the color we want to come through is coming through. Let's get back down in here. This is really difficult. So again, this is like my first time streaming. I don't even know if anybody's like watching or paying attention. That's okay if you're not. Like, this is just my first time kind of doing this. Like I said, I figured like I've been just kind of sitting here painting these on my own. Maybe I won't feel as lonely if I'm like recording it or whatever. It also gives me the opportunity to kind of like talk to myself without feeling like a psychopath. So that's what I'm getting out of this. Um, but yeah, I mean, if you're new to mini painting, if you haven't started mini painting, but it's something like you're interested in, it's really a really satisfying hobby, and it, you really got to look at mini painting as an art form. It's definitely an art form. I know it on face value, you know, in the textbooks, it just seems kind of ridiculous, right? Like, oh, you're painting little toys. Let's be honest, you're painting little toys. But if you look at any competitive painters, Golden Demon stuff, anybody who's painting and operating on that competitive level, and you see the kind of stuff that they're producing, it's really difficult to not consider mini painting an art form. When you look at how people are utilizing color, how they're utilizing textures and tones, hues. Those professional mini painters, those top tier mini painters, they're applying the same sort of skill set that like any kind of artist would apply. You're talking color theory, you're talking the physics of light. All of those things go into really good mini painting. And so it's if you're starting out, or if you're kind of new, you're kind of interested, make no mistake, mini painting is definitely an art form. No different than if you were to be sitting at your desk with a watercolor palette, or a canvas and some acrylic paints. Mini painting is just as challenging and technical as any of those other sort of art mediums or art styles. It also requires a good deal of skill. You need to again have really good brush control. You need to have a good toolbox of different techniques like dry brushing and glazing, edge highlighting, recess shading. All of those things are skills that you apply in affecting this kind of art, right? So again, on that face value, if you're reading it in a textbook, it's like, well, you're painting toys. Well, yeah, that's true. But it's still a very challenging and rewarding art medium. So again, we're just kind of going through this back pelt. We're trying to again keep our colors in the lines. As you can see, again, I've already got the body piece, that boiled leather armor, kind of dialed in and where I want it to be. And so if I accidentally slip over and tag that green with my brush, then it's going to ruin all the work that I put into getting that green where I want it to be. Obviously, we can go back through and we can fix it, but sometimes it's hard, especially if you've already worked through your final layer, your final highlights, your final shadings of that particular area. Then I'd have to go back through and like really try and match that color and then cover up any kind of mistakes with that color. And so you really want to again practice your brush control so that you can keep your colors where you want them, and not ruin any work that you've already kind of gone through. We're on layer 3 or 4 on this side. I don't know. We might be on layer 3 on this side. So just based on how these colors are drying out and depositing on the mini, we might have to do like 5 to 6 layers of this mixture of Zemestry Desert and XV88 brown. For all my colors, I just use Games Workshop. I went through, there was a couple years there where I was going through and trying a bunch of different paints, like the Army Painter and Vallejo, those brands of paints. And what I find is I mostly paint Games Workshop minis anyway. And so, if I'm looking at a paint scheme or like a color recipe or something, I would say like 7 times out of 10, the recipe calls for a Games Workshop color. And so what you have to do then, if you wanted to go with like Vallejo or the Army Painter, is you gotta go to the conversion chart and find the relevant color um, for like that brand. And for me, I'm just too lazy. That's just an extra step that I have to take. And so I'm paying a premium because like Games Workshop colors are more expensive than the other brands. And so I'm paying a premium to get Games Workshop, but it's like that added step of having to convert. For me, it's worth it. So if you're watching the video and you're thinking, well, I want to try that color scheme, but I don't want to commit to the price point of a Games Workshop paint pot. I totally understand that. So you can take my color recipe and you can throw it in the conversion chart and see which color that either Vallejo or Army Painter or whatever else you're using would match with that. So now we're here on this left side. I think this is number 3. No, this is not number 3. We just did number 3. I think this is number 4, number 5. And we're already getting the saturation that we're kind of looking for. So we can kind of see here on this left side, we're getting that kind of freshly tanned leather look. And it's coming through really well. It looks a little bland, it looks a little flat, but that's okay because we're going to go through with a shade step. And that shade step is really what's going to like start to bring out some depth and some textures into the mini. Just mixing up some paint here on the side. I think if I keep doing this, I'll definitely figure out a way that I can have my palette displayed on the screen as well. I think that would be cool, so you guys can see how I'm mixing my paint, how I'm loading my brush, all that good stuff. There we go. So you can see I kind of went a little heavy on my brush there, and you can kind of see some paint pooling up a little bit, but it's not so much that it's noticeable, and so we're just going to kind of leave it like that. The other thing that we get when we build up with like 3 to 5 or even 10 layers of this base coat is if you start to notice here on the border between the transition of the inner pelt and the outer pelt, we're starting to get like that black line, but it's a black line that's kind of gradually fading into this brighter color. That's going to give us a much better, much more realistic look for our mini. At least in my opinion, it gives us a more realistic look in our mini. I enjoy the way that those colors transition as you build up from a very thin glaze consistency. And again, it also, once again, it helps us develop that brush control. When you've got to deposit 5 or 6 layers in the same area consistently over time, you really begin to develop that skill rather of brush control. If you're starting as a mini painter, or if you're maybe thinking you might be interested in it, number one skill to practice, number one skill to develop is brush control. And if you think about mini painting as an art form, if you think about it and you think about it in the context of other art forms, your brush control, if you're doing canvas art, or your brush control if you're doing like watercolors or something, it's just as important. You can be an amazing sketcher, you could be an amazing penciler, and when you go and try and transition to maybe doing canvas paintings, you could have the best vision in the world, man. You've got like the Punisher punch or shooting through the moon or something, some absurd thing that you'd maybe want to paint on a canvas or paint with watercolor or something like that. You can have the vision and you can have the skill to sketch out the particular piece that you're drawing, but if you can't effectively get your paintbrush to touch where you want, either on canvas or on a mini, then you're not going to be able to really affect that vision that you had for that art piece. And so developing your brush control as a foundational skill really is important as a mini painter, or as a painter or an artist in general. As you can see here on this left side, we're right where we want to be with the saturation of this mixture, of this semestry desert and XV88 mixture. And so I think we're going to call it on that. I'm going to touch this up here on the bottom just a little bit more, and then we'll move on to our shade step. Shading is really fun. I think shading is one of the best things, recess shading that is one of the best things that you can do to develop your brush control, because you're working with really thin paints in really specific and targeted spots. And so we'll kind of go through that right now. We'll look at what that looks like. We got a little bit of wet paint here on the left, but as you can see, it's dry up here. And as we start to recess shade, these colors are going to pop really well. So let's look at what that recess shade looks like while the pelt is drying. So we'll pull our palette out. This is where we had that mixture. There's the Zemestry Desert, there's the XV88, and there's that kind of 50-50 mixture that we put there in the middle. We're going to take this here. This is a excuse me. This is a Skeleton Horde. It's a contrast paint by Games Workshop. I'm going to put a little bit on our palette, and we can see that it's a really kind of deep, saturated, rich brown. But as you pull it out, you start to see that it's a bit of a kind of a yellowy brown. And so we want to take advantage of that pigment there. So we're going to thin this down pretty well, and then we're going to take our brush. After loading it up, we're going to take our brush and we're going to start shading in the recesses of our bear pelt. It's going to look good. What I like to do, and this is something that's really good to kind of get in the habit of, is putting a dollop of the paint that you want to use in one spot of your palette, putting a dollop of water in another spot of your palette, and then mixing it in on your palette. This gives you a lot more control over how dark and how deep you want those colors to look. And once you get it to sort of the saturation that you want, then it's time to take your mini, or take it to your mini. But it's always important to take your time to get these paints thinned out, to get your brush loaded up as good as you can. As you can see, I'm wiping off a lot of the extra moisture, and as I'm doing so, I'm doing a little twist in my brush. That helps me to keep a really good fine point on my brush. And I'm not using anything special. I'm using the Citadel brand layer brushes, and they're pretty good. They're a bit pricey, but I find like the balance between their price point and their quality is okay. Sometimes you'll get a bad brush and you'll get something like let me see, where's my bad brush at? Sometimes you'll get a bad brush and you'll get something like shit, I can't find a bad brush. You'll have something like this happen. So you can see there's some fraying in the brush. A lot of times this happens because we're not loading our brush properly. And what I mean by that is, when we're loading our brush, we want the paint to just kind of be from the belly out to the point. If we let a lot of paint get up here back towards like the shaft of it is, the paintbrushes, then the paint will start drying down here where these bristles meet, and then that'll start pushing and expanding out your brush, and we'll get this fraying effect. I've had GW brushes just straight off the shelf. I load them up one time and they will look like this, and so that's what I'm saying. You know, the quality is okay, but sometimes you get a bad brush. This was a bad brush, definitely, but this brush wasn't bad. So you know, it's kind of up and down sometimes. Anyway, there's also, you know, tons of different brands and types of brushes too for mini painting that you can pick up. So it really does boil down to preference for the mini painter. But if you're just starting out, grabbing one medium brush from the GW store, if that's where you're going, you're not going to go wrong there. You'll be fine. And to be completely frank too, as you're starting out as a mini painter, you are going to fuck up brushes. Like, you're going to mess some brushes up. So it's going to happen. So anyway, we have our shade color, shade tone, and what we're going to try and do with the point of our brush is deposit that shade up into these transitional areas. And that's going to help us bridge the gap between our light color and our dark color. And we're going to do this over the course of maybe 5 or 6 layers. We're also going to do it down here. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a little bit of green pigment that kind of fell off, and it's kind of hitting this inside bear pelt. As we begin to develop our shade layers here, our recess shading, then we're going to start covering up that green and developing a really nice transition between this part of the mini and that part of the mini. It's going to give us some depth and like I said, a really good smooth transition. So we're going to cover the entire inside of the bear pelt first with our shade, and that's going to allow us to kind of see a bit of a guide as to where the textures are in our area. So for example, by just dropping that one little light layer of shade, I can see that there's this little ridge here that's really pronounced. And so now I know that when I come back through with my recess shading, I'm going to try and hit under this to shade this down to make it a little darker. Same here, we can kind of see a little bit more texture down here. So as I come back in with my shade, my recess shading, I'm going to hit these areas to darken them up. So let's go through the rest of this while this guy dries with our shade layer. I'm not going to mess with this bottom layer too much. It's not going to be even an afterthought for the actual mini itself, and I'll show you what I mean by that. If we look at the completed mini, I do have some, obviously I have some recess shading going on, and I've got some highlights on that Zemestri Desert, but I didn't really do much down here, and it's because honestly nobody's going to see it. You know, the mini's going to be on the board. No one's going to look up underneath the mini. In addition, the focal point of the mini isn't that little back piece there. The focus of the mini is the torso and the basing. So we're not going to spend too much time on the little in between leg flaps. Let's load up our brush. It's important to keep your brush clean. So you do a couple layers. And then you come through and you rinse your brush, get your point back, and then start fresh again. So here we go with more of this color. And we're going to do the whole panel. After we do this first pass on the whole panel, then we're going to go through and we'll start really focusing in on our recess shading. There we go. All right. So we've got one layer of that shade down. Now this part is almost dry. I'm going to say it is dry because it's almost dry, but it's gonna dry out pretty soon. It's really important to let your layers dry, especially when you're working with these really thin kind of watery layers. It's really important to let your layers dry in between, otherwise you're gonna fuck up everything that you've worked on. So with that, I'm gonna try to blow a little bit here. Typically, if you're not doing this style of mini painting, and you're doing something like batch painting would be like, you've got, all 12 of these ladies on your table. You pick up one, you put down a layer, then you get another one, you put down a layer, and you just kind of do that in batches. If you take that style of painting, obviously you don't have to sit here and wait for the paint to dry, you just move on to the next mini. But lately I've been staying away, not shying away, I've been staying away from batch painting. And I think it's because I'm trying this, philosophy of, I want to give each mini their time. I want to really enjoy painting the mini for the sake of painting the mini, not necessarily for the sake of just getting the mini done and on the table. There's definitely space for that in the mini painting community for you to want to maybe just rapidly get your minis on the table. And typically, it depends on what you get out of the hobby. When it comes to tabletop wargaming, you can put a lot of focus in the painting aspect of it and the art of it, and that's cool. That's your that's what you get out of it, right? A lot of people, they really like the tabletop aspect of it, the gaming of it, rolling dice, having fun with your friends. Like, that's great. And so those people tend to want to get their minis on the table as quickly as possible because their focus isn't on the painting aspect of it, and which is totally cool. That's one of the best things about tabletop wargaming as a hobby, is that there's something for everybody. For me, I really like to paint. I view mini painting as an art form. It's challenging, it's technical, it's satisfying, and it's kind of cool to like show your friends, like, hey, look at this 2-inch warrior that I like painted with really good detail and whatnot. So it's just something that not a lot of people do as an art form, and so I really like that aspect of it. You also might like just the lore in the universe of something like either A Song of Ice and Fire or Games Workshop games like Warhammer 40k or Age of Sigmar. And if you're into that part of it, that's great, man. There's books for you to read, there's wikis, there's fan fiction, and so there really is, within the tabletop wargaming community, there really is something for everybody, and that's what I really like about it, is the game's ability and the hobby's ability to kind of bring people together from different interests, modeling, painting, playing, lore, right? And you just kind of bring them all together, and you just kind of geek out on the different aspects of the hobby. So yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, to be honest with you. I'm just talking as I paint, man. So we can kind of already see we're toning down that undercoat, that 50-50 mix of Zemestri Desert or Zemesi Desert and XV88. We're really toning it down. So now what we're going to start focusing on is getting our brush into these areas here, right in that transitional area. And that's going to be good for us because it's going to help us establish a soft transition between the different components of the mini. So let's keep doing that. Again, the downside of my method here is that, we gotta wait for these paints to dry before we go from layer to layer. So let's continue to take a bead of shade here. This line of shade is gonna help us ease the transition between the furry tufts of the pelt and then the actual inside of the leather. So we're just gonna keep gradually building up these shades. A little dollop there, put some down here underneath where we would actually have a shadow if this was sort of a real life mini. And just little tiny flecks of brush strokes, man. This is really how I developed and honed my brush control. It's just trying to get these little targeted recess shades. And we can definitely go darker. Like, I'm using a really thinned down skeleton horde. That's the contrast paint that we're using to do this recess shade. But I think it would be kind of disingenuous to like pitch this idea of like thin your paints and build up slowly, just for me to kind of go in and drop a more or a less watered down version of this paint. So we're just going to build it up slowly, man, little by little. Get it right in there, a little bit down there. Okay. Again, we're not going to fuck with that guy anymore. We're done there. But now this side is dry again, so we'll transition on back, build out that transition or that shade between these two layers. Throw in more skeleton horde down here in the middle. As we continue to build up our shade layers, what I'll do is go a little bit darker. Once I have a good shade in between those transitions, I'll go a little bit darker, and I'll try and get a little more targeted so that I can get a darker shade right in the crack. but I don't know if we're going to get there. I don't know if we're going to get to that point yet. Okay. So we'll keep going. So now you see we're like really wet, but you can already start seeing from that first bit after we built up those layers, you can already start seeing some of that texture and some of those shades and different tones come out. And so we're doing it. I mean, it's working the way we want it to work. I think we'll go a little bit darker though, so that we're not just chasing these really, really thin glazed layers. Yeah, so we'll kind of come out here and do a little more of that there. So we went a little bit darker on our shade. Oh, and I just fucked up. It's okay. We're okay. This is why it's important to let your layers dry in between like applications. And it's, if you noticed down here in this crease, I didn't let it dry and I ended up smearing or smudging the paint. But that's okay because it's a shade layer and we're going to continue to work through it. Now, the other thing you can do if you're doing this this strategy of one mini at a time is you can have two projects or two parts of the mini being worked at the same time. So long as they're not close to one another or they're not butting up against one another and there's no risk of like paint running off and mixing. So, for example, if we wanted to, in the meantime, while we're waiting for this paint to dry on the back of the pelts, we can start working on some of these pelts here, these bear pelts on the leg. We could also work on the leather pieces here. We could work on the chainmail, any of the things that aren't necessarily right up against the particular part that we're trying to shade. But we're not going to do that. I think I got like 20 minutes before I got to get my kids, so I think we're just going to chill and continue to build up these shades. A lot of dudes, what they'll do is they'll grab a little hair dryer, and they'll not blast, but they'll throw the hair dryer and point the hair dryer at their mini to help speed up the process of painting in between layers. You could also give it a nice blow, but you could also just take it chill, let the paint dry, plan out your next bit where you're going to put your brush strokes, what you're going to work on, that kind of thing. So yeah, I've been painting Warhammer minis and Games Workshop minis and all different kinds of minis here and there for about 20 years, on and off, obviously. I mean, if I was painting consistently for 20 years, I think I would be a hell of a lot better than I am now. But I've been painting on and off for a good 20 years. And what I'm finding is, in the past I would buy like a new army box, right? So most recently last year I started a Tau army for 40K, and I bought a ton of minis, just more minis than I could possibly deal with at the time. And I started feeling like this sense of like anxiety, like, man, I got to get these minis painted and I got to get them on the table. And I found myself like rushing through the paints, right? Not enjoying the painting, not at all, just rushing through so that I can say that I've got a completed army. And as I take a step back and I look at the minis that I've painted for my Tau army, I'm not necessarily happy or unhappy with them. I'm just kind of in the middle, a little agnostic about it. And I kind of came to the realization that like, that's not the way I want to paint. I don't want to be always chasing this feeling of like, oh, I need to get this done, right? I really want to take my time and give each mini its time in my hand, give each mini its attention. And I feel like if that's the case, like if I do that, I might not have an army completed anytime soon, but when I am eventually completed, I'll be much more proud and satisfied with the work that I've done. And so I'm really, really trying to take this one mini at a time approach just again to slow down and to try and get away from the feeling that like I have to get a specific army or a specific mini done or painted. The other thing that I like about it, and I don't know if I've mentioned this or not, but the other thing I like about doing one mini at a time, aside from the fact that you're really putting as much time as you can into one mini, and enjoying the process, but the other thing that I like about it is it adds a degree of like variability to the mini. You know, if you look at our base coats here on the fur, they're not exactly the same. I finished this fur a couple days ago, the inside of this pelt a couple days ago, and so now I'm working on this inside. But as you can tell, this one's a little bit darker, and my paint mixture wasn't exactly the same. And what that does is it adds a little individual characteristic for each mini. No two minis, despite the fact that these are two of the same minis, the same model, when you're doing a one mini at a time strategy, like no two minis are going to look exactly the same. And I really like that idea because it's adding that extra bit of authenticity to the mini. You know, you want the mini to look, you know, relevant. You want it to look realistic, and by having each mini kind of have its own individual characteristic, it really kind of it lends itself to that. So that's another thing that I like about working on one mini at a time. Less stress because you're not worried about, look, I got to paint 10 more body pieces today. Nah, you paint your body piece, you get it where you want it, and then you move on to the next part of the mini. And you just kind of keep going around. You do it all again. And hopefully the intent, like I said, is that at the end of it, you come out with a really well-produced project. So again, if we're looking at how our colors are changing, we're using the same color, Skeleton Horde, but we're starting to see that darker, that transition kind of coming out. I think maybe it's a little heavy here, but we could always fix that by just kind of glazing over it. And eventually, after 4 or 5 layers, we'll have a smoother transition between these two things. But if we look at it, we're looking at a much different piece. You know, this was way different looking when we started. Now we're pulling out all of the texture. We're pulling out the movement of the piece, and by doing really kind of targeted recess shades, you know, we're really bringing out the life. We're bringing out the life of the mini. I don't know. So hopefully you all can see that too. Yeah, we'll pull that there. So yeah, so I think, I mean, in terms of recess shades, I think we're kind of right where we want to be. Maybe I want a little bit more contrast here to kind of highlight that little bump, and we might want a little more contrast here in that boundary between the body piece and the inside of the pelt. So we're going to let that dry, and we're going to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to take a drink of coffee. Excuse me. So yeah, I've got a couple of examples of stuff that I can show you. There's an example of what you can do with just a base layer and some contrast paints. This is Slaneshi Demonette. I used an airbrush on this one. I did a base layer of I used a contrast paint to base layer this pink, and then I airbrushed a lighter pink on top. It's called a Zenithal highlight. Zenithal or Zenithal, one of the two. But we can kind of see the cool transitions we can get with a nice contrast paint. So this is all just one colored contrast paint over the pink, and then I pulled it out just barely so that it kind of looks like the claw is transitioning into the arm. Same with the feet down here. We kind of got that same effect kind of coming up. So this is really cool stuff that you can do with a contrast paint. Again, this is all just one pink base layer, but I use different contrast paints throughout. Like the hair has got a different contrast paint than the claws and all that. And so if you're looking to just get models on the table, you can definitely go the contrast paint route, and it looks nice. There's nothing wrong with a good contrast paint. I've got another example of what you can do with a contrast paint. This was for my Slanesh army. This is a work in progress. As you can see, I've got a lot of these work in progresses sitting around, but it's an unfinished cavalry archer. But the legs and the body and the hair all were done with contrast paints. And so that contrast paint really does, 1 layer, 2 layers, really brings out the raised areas of a mini. But it doesn't bring out the raised areas. Like, you're not highlighting up. It's more that you're shading down, right? And that's kind of the method here with contrast paints, and that's kind of what I'm trying to approximate here with more of a traditional style of painting. Is instead of laying down your base layer and then shading and then bringing up highlights, we're laying down our base layer and then we're recess shading, and then we'll bring up our highlights, and it'll give us a really good transition of colors. So now that this is dry, let's finish it out. We're gonna throw a couple of beads of kind of darker, less watered down, so more saturated skeleton horde here to affect that transition, and then here to affect this transition, and we'll pull it there. We might get a little bit more there. That'll work. Oh man, I think I messed up. Oh no, we're good. Okay. Good. That's pretty good. We probably want a little bit more up here. But again, so we can kind of see what recess shading the way that we did really helped the mini. We didn't do any highlights. This is just our base color. But because we did targeted recess shades, this now part that wasn't recess shaded looks as though we went through a layer of highlights. Same here. We didn't do any highlighting here or down there, and yet because we had that recess shading and that boundary, that transitional layer shading, we've got some semblance of highlights there. And so now when we go through and we actually highlight, those highlights will pop a little bit more. And so let's go through that process a little bit. I think we're good with our recess shadings. So the process of this highlight would be, this is our original mix of our internal bear pelt. We did a 50-50 mix of XV88 and Zamesi Desert, and we watered it down. So what we're going to do now is just add more Zamesi Desert to the mix. And then we'll probably have to pop in a little bit more water to that, but we'll add a little more Zamesi Desert. Not a lot. We want it to be a gradual highlight, a gradual transition. We don't want it to be in your face just yet. We do in your face highlights for like edge highlights, but not for sort of those medium toned highlights. So that's a pretty good base. We want it to be thin because we're going to build up these highlights in layers as well. It's just about how thin we want it. It's probably good there. So just think, I don't know, I work with really thin glaze consistencies, and I kind of think of it like a watercolor. So I kind of go for a watercolor consistency, a thinned out watercolor consistency. And I go, the common piece of advice that you get when you start mini painting is that you want your paints to be thinned down to the consistency of like cream, heavy cream, or milk. And that definitely has its place. That strategy has its place. But if you're looking for really smooth transitions, not to say that my transitions are very smooth, but if you're looking for really smooth transitions, you want to work with more of a thinned out glaze consistency and built up in 2 to 3 or 3 to 5 layers. We're going to be selective about where we put our highlights here, and we're going to use our original shade as a guide for that. And so we're going to try and place our highlights in spots where, number one, we didn't recess shade, but also where our original shade guide didn't go. That was that very first shade that we put down and that we use to cover the entire pelt. Actually, and now that I'm thinking of or looking at this, I think we might be a little too bright on our Zemesi. I think we may have added a little too much Zemesi, but that's okay because it's our mini, and we can do whatever we want. So if we have a bit of or too much of a contrast between the highlight layer and the median layer, that's okay. Let's add a little more water to that. Maybe a little more X. There we go. Maybe that'll work. Let's see how that goes. Okay. And the mini is going to look different when it dries as well. So it might look a little too bright when you're first putting it down when it's wet, but as it dries, especially these brighter colors, they tend to dull down just a little bit, just enough. So don't stress out if your mini is coming out as like a little too bright when you're starting to do your build up, your median highlight. Put some down there. Okay. Now, if you notice, like I didn't go through and highlight each part of the internal or the inside of the cloak. I'm doing selective highlights. I've already done a lot of work with the base color and my recess shading, and so I'm going to try and capitalize on all that work and do a little bit less work when it comes to putting in my highlights. And so I'm being very selective about it. I'm looking for the raised areas. I'm pulling my paint around. I'm not just leaving it in one spot. That's going to help with easing the transitions between two colors. And I'm being selective. And so now it's going to go real quick, right? Because I'm just going to start hitting the same 3 or 4 spots on each side. Those spots are going to dry quickly because it's not a lot of paint we're putting down, and we're just going to keep going back and forth, back and forth. So we'll put a little bit more there, a little bit there, boom, boom. Cool. So we're seeing this nice buildup of now brighter tones. As a matter of fact, we probably put a little bit more this way. And try to keep, yeah, there we go. I'm trying to keep this in focus, man. I've never done a stream before, so this is all new to me. Like, how do I move my? I feel like Ricky Bobby in his first interview. Like, I don't know what to do with my hands, you know. We're gonna go a little bit brighter now, just a smidge brighter, maybe half a brush full of Zemesi Desert into our the very last mix that we used, and now we're gonna go even smaller with our highlight. So I'm gonna pull this right down here to this ridge. I'm just gonna do a real quick line right there, and then pull these out. Maybe add a little bit there, just so it flows a little bit more. Okay, so there was that. And we're going to come to this side and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to try and keep it right at where we think the light would hit our mini. Right there. And then we'll pull this one out just a little bit there. Come down here, get it right up on that edge, and then I think we are going to call that done. And that's our bear pelt. So we did a base coat of Zemesi Desert, 50-50 mix of Zemesi Desert and XV88. We did a recess shade. We did a full shade, a very light full shade with Skeleton Horde, and then we did a recess shade with Skeleton Horde, building up those shadow colors. And then we did a gradually increased how do I say that? Then we did a mixture of Zemesi Desert and XV88 with gradually increasing Zemesi Desert until we got to just Zemesi Desert for our final highlights. And so, what we have is just easy transitions, subtle shading, and it provides, I think, a bit more of a realistic mini. And again, we talk about one mini at a time, the individualism of each mini when painting that way, and we can totally see that here. This looks different than this. Not too much different. Not different to where they're going to look like different minis when you're looking at them on the table, but their paint scheme, their color hues, they're definitely different. I think that's going to add a little bit of authenticity or individualism to each mini, which is cool. So if you actually stuck around and you watched the stream, hey, I want to say hey, thanks for hanging out with me for a little bit. This was a cool exercise for me because I've never done a stream before, and I got to talk without feeling like I'm talking to myself. So it was fun. We're gonna go ahead and close out the stream, close out the video, and next time I'm doing this, we'll be doing probably the bear pelts and the leather. So catch you guys then.